Hello, this is the 257th edition of Catch of the Day, available on the Branch Talk YouTube channel. Today we're going to continue reading from a book written by Trent Wilding entitled The Mosaic Torah. Starting on page 18, third of the way down, it says, "And he removed him from before himself, and appointed him as his commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David was prudent in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And Saul saw how he was very prudent, and he was annoyed by his presence. And all Israel and Judah loved David, because he came in and went out before the presence of the people. Then Saul said to David, 'Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as your wife. Only be a brave warrior for me and fight the battles of Yahweh.' For Saul thought, 'My hand will not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him.' But David said to Saul, 'Who am I, and who are my relatives, the clan of my father in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king?' But at the time Saul's daughter Merab was to be given to David, she was given instead to Adriel, the Mehethoronite, as wife. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, loved David. And she told Saul, and it was good in his eyes. So Saul said, 'I will give her to him, and she will be a trip for him.' And the hand of the Philistines was against Saul, and Saul commanded his servants, saying, 'Speak all of you covertly with David, saying, Look, the king desires for you, and all his servants love you, so you must become a son-in-law to the king.' So the servants of Saul spoke into the ear of David these words. And David replied, 'Is it simple in your eyes to become the son-in-law of the king? And I am a humble man, and do not have honor.' And the servants of Saul reported to him about these words that David spoke." Footnote 22. This period makes sense when translating the MT, but it should be left out when translating or reading DG2. The MT editor made, and this is footnote number 23, the MT editor made this sentence to be a part of Saul's words from the previous verse and changed it to read, "And the hand of the Philistines may be against him," thus trying this passage to a passage in DG2, 18 verse 17. The MT editor also adds the words, "So Saul said to David, 'You now have a second chance to become my son-in-law.'" These words are an attempt on the part of the editor to tie together DG2, wherein Merab was to be given to David as his wife, with DG1, in which Michal is said to be given to David as his wife. And Saul said, "This is what you should say to David. The king has no desire for a bride gift, but rather for 100 foreskins from the Philistines, for revenge against the enemies of the king." And Saul was counting on him being thrown into the hands of the Philistines. And the servants of Saul explained to David these words. And the issue seemed fair to David's eyes, to become a son-in-law to the king. So David rose, and he and his men went, and he struck against the Philistines 100 men, and brought their foreskins to the king. And he became a son-in-law to the king. And he gave to Michal, his daughter, to him as his wife. And Saul saw that the Lord was with David, and all Israel loved him. And he grew in his wary suspicion of David even more. 1 Samuel 16, verse 14 to 18, 29. So Saul became a perpetual enemy of David. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out for battle, and as often as they went out, David succeeded more than all the servants of Saul, and his name became very esteemed. 1 Samuel 17, verse 12 to 31, 41, 48b, 50, 55, and 18, 6a, and 10 to 11, 12b, 12, 19, and 29b to 30, LEB. The text itself, as you can see above, is what shows more clearly than anything else that 1 Samuel 16, 14 to 18:30 in the MT truly is a combination of two originally separated documents. Again, our reason for taking the time to demonstrate this is to illustrate the fact that there are writings in the Bible which have been formed through the combining of multiple originally separate documents. 1 Samuel 16 to 18 is a particularly powerful example, since this editorial process is evidenced directly by the manuscripts, and they plainly reveal the content of each original document. One could imagine, however, that it would be possible to discern the different sources even if we didn't have the manuscript evidence. If we only had the MT, one could still notice that Goliath seems to be introduced twice in these chapters, and that some passages portray Saul as knowing David prior to the encounter with Goliath, whereas others picture them as not knowing each other until after Goliath had been slain. By taking note of differences such as these, one could split the chapters into two categories. Footnote 24. The MT says Michal, the daughter of Saul, instead of all Israel. 25, literally, and. The fact that the content of each category would read smoothly on its own and form a story that is more internally consistent than when the two are combined would serve as confirming evidence. Manuscript evidence is great, and it makes the task of identifying and separating sources much easier, but it is only one among many types of evidence. In the study of the Torah, the first evidence that indicated to scholars that it is a combination of multiple different sources was a phenomenon known as doublets. A doublet is a story or a saying that occurs more than once, often in varying forms. For example, there are two stories of the institution of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 15 and 17. Two stories of the naming of Beersheba, Genesis 21 and 26. Two stories of Jacob's name being changed to Israel, Genesis 32 and 35. Two stories of Moses getting water from the rock at a place called Meribah, Exodus 17 and Numbers 20, etc. Take care.